Okay, so here we are at the next item in week 10, the edit and delete buttons. Before I start into that work, but if you want, you can go ahead and set up 22 handle edit and delete from the ending code of 21. And by the way, at this point, hopefully you already know, make sure you're on the same numbering as I am. It just makes grading much easier. So I had a good question, and I hope, Robert, you don't mind me saying this out on Discord about semicolons. And kind of my thing is like, JavaScript will automatically insert them. There's actually a logic they apply. And then I thought, well, you know what? I could do a little more reading. So, and I did. And then I honestly went and asked ChatGDP. so, in JavaScript, the ending is optional, but it's recommended. And that I had heard varying reports about this. And I don't know if I would say like anything I've kind of warned you about with some of these generative, and that's what this is. This chat GDP is generative. You have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, but I verified this with just some general searching around as well. Right, can make it more explicit. So, I don't know if it makes it easier to read. Honestly, to me, it's just more stuff in my file. So they are optional because JavaScript, when it goes through and interprets, compiles in kind of on the fly way your code, it actually will do it automatically. Okay, so which is kind of cool. But we can't explicitly do it. And here's one of the ways, just for the code we've been writing, you could do it through VS Code. So what you can do is go into the little gear and go into settings. And under settings, you can search for semicolons. Under semicolons, you'll find generally the first thing listed, and mine by default was ignore. But I went ahead and hit insert. And I was like, okay, so is that all I got to do? Just insert those? Okay, so I hit X and I got out. Which, by the way, that's a setting in a JSON file, which we're going to learn about soon. You're just updating that setting. So I was like, okay, so where are my semicolons? Isn't it automatically going to do it? Well, yeah, generally going forward it will, but one thing you can do is just do Control A, select everything. And you do need to get out of the editor and get back in. Right click and do Format Selection. And then those semicolons will be there for you. I say let the editor do what it do and let it do it well. But it is good to know, especially as you start to write more complex code and JavaScript, to understand how to terminate lines, because sometimes, and I find it, like I said, more when you do more advanced coding. Okay, now let's talk about this. So here we are. Now we're back. We're getting ready to start working here. So where we left off was when we entered data, right? We rendered our table, sweet. So now we have our edit and delete buttons. So one of the things I want to just review for a moment here is that call stack I had mentioned before. So as an example, let's put the call stack on, let's do it on one of the more like where it calls several, like on the render. So on the event, inside the event listener, right before you call the render, okay, right before render table, in here, right here. For me, it's 136, okay. At this point, let's go ahead and refresh, okay. We know we're going to lose our data. Enter some more data. Remember, because this is inside the event listener, it's not going to trigger your dev tools until you hit submit. Okay, so now we're walking through code. So we see that at this point, where's the call stack? Yeah, the call stack right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and step. Okay, so now we have, right, what's running, and it doesn't clearly show the global context, but we're running our render table is our function call out of the event listener. So if we just let it kind of run through here, right, and at this point, it's rendering the headings. Actually, I'm sorry. Actually, here, I did it a little quickly. the first thing rendered table did was it called rendered table called the rendered table headings, right? So if we just keep, and we'll see after after it finishes, right? After it sets up those headings for each one of those items in the strings in the array. Okay, after it does that, then it returns. So then, boom, when we look at the call stack now, we're only one function in. Really, the stack is just one, and it's called from the event listener. Okay. Now, the more, of course, now that we're going to do some more, right? And then we call the render once we get to this, right? So here's my point. Once we complete, let me just go ahead and let it resume execution, right? There's nothing on the call stack, which means everything has executed at that point, okay? And the only thing that in our code could be executed is the event listener, because it's listening for something. And it has this thing we've been talking about, which is a callback. So code by its default nature is synchronous. It operates in sequence. And then specific design patterns will then have, in this case, an event listener, right, is waiting. But at that point, your whole entire code base has executed. Okay. And that's important to know, is because you've lost, in some sense, context, except for what happens in here. Now we can call the other functions, of course, right? Because that's what we do inside of here. But everything else is done as far as the call stack. It's only waiting at this point only because we have an event listener. So the reason I bring this up is we're getting ready to write an event listener here for these edit and delete buttons. Okay. So first thing is, we're not going to write them out on the global scope like this has been done. The reason we did it here was because we set up this button from the form and we were listening for, right, submit clicks, submit on the button. Okay. But now we're dynamically generating these buttons. So just knowing that, what's your guess for where because we're going to have to write event listeners for these buttons. Okay. So if you guessed where we create them, that's the right answer. Okay. Now, here we create the buttons, here we edit the context, right? So we could, either way, as long as we do it before we append it into the TD, it doesn't quite matter in this sequence. So I would do it here. So what do we need to do? Let's just kind of, comment it out. We need to add an event listener. Now, in this case, are we adding a form? And the answer is no. We could, but we don't have to, because you can add event listeners just for buttons themselves, right? We're not, in this case, inputting any other data. We're just listening for a click event inside of that, inside of or on that button. And that's important. So we're going to, okay. Now, what are we going to do once the user clicks the button, either the delete or the edit? Obviously, we're going to do something a little different for each of them, but we're going to have to do some kind of action, in this case for the edit, right? For edit, here's how we're going to handle it. When the user hits edit, I almost want to do local storage now, but once the user hits the edit, then we want to take the values here and reassign or place the values, update these input fields with those values. Okay. And by the way, we could actually go ahead and get rid of this one because we no longer need it. But that's what we need to do, right? So we need for edit is we need to reference the object in the array, okay, for the current row in the table. and populate the form input fields. How do we do that, right? It sounds complicated, but let's start with doing this, right? And so what are we going to write? We're going to write on the edit BTN. We're going to do add event listener. The event listener, in this case, we're going to listen for a click. And when we click, we're going to do something, okay? So this pattern of setting up an event listener, we're listening for something, we're calling back, we're doing this. Once we get the click, then we're doing this code, right? So in this way, our code is setting and listening for something. Well, let's do this. Let's do E, okay? So E is the event itself, okay? So once we do this, go back here, okay? Cool. Now, how do we know it worked? Or what do we do? And this is where I showed you before, right? Where do we see that console log? I have to go find it. Oh, it's past here. It's time for us to create modules. It is time. We are there. All right, so here, I say that because there's so much code in here. So here we are, right? We're listening for that event. So as soon as somebody clicks here, it's pausing because I have a breakpoint. But if I just let it run, then I see it said, okay, there was an event. If you want to know all the information on that event, here it is. Wow. Okay. Tons of stuff. A lot of it we'll never use. Okay. But probably the one we have already used, which is the more common, is e.target. So what this shows me is that, oh, the click was on a button. Okay. Now, what do I need to know? So now I'm listening for a click on the button. Now, what do I do when I have that button? Okay. Okay. So how do we, for now, so we edit the reference for edit, I should say. Reference the object in the array. Okay. So at this point, we know we have, right, the my data. Okay. And we know we only have one object. But if we have multiples, how do we know which line? Okay, so let's just do that. Oh, live server, you're making me crazy. Right? So we know we have two objects in the array. We know when we click here, and by the way, both of these, right? Doesn't matter because look at this. If we click here, we still, because what's happening, and this is important to understand, is because we're rendering each of these buttons based on being called from the for. So the for loop on the my data. So it's going to create these based on the number of objects in the array. Okay. So when you're doing more advanced CRUD apps, you have to do a little more work here to say, okay, how do I know which of these that I clicked on? And there's strategies using what's called a UUID. UUIDs are kind of cool because you can create unique identifiers. Now, why would you want to do that? Is then you can uniquely say, okay, here's the ID, right? And can I grab into this line by making, some of the data fields have that ID? But honestly, for this app, we don't have to do that. We don't have to get that complicated because we already have and in this case, the index related to whatever when we click the edit. Now you might wonder, how do we have it? Well, let's go back and look, right? Because we're calling render from here. We're calling it from right here. And what do we have in here? We have the object on the for each. Well, if you remember our discussion on the for each, we actually also have the index. Yeah, check that out. We have, because remember before when we were writing a traditional for loop, we we're setting up the I, iterating over, checking the length and updating I, but on the for each, it does it without us having to write that code, but we still have access to the index. So what do? We just pass the index into the render edit button here, okay? And then in here, let's just say index, just so we can see it, right? It should actually just, you know what I could do? This would be kind of a fun one to do, is just actually render this table call. It was something, anyway, by the way, don't get me started. I'm trying to show it in a logical sequence we're doing it. So now when I click here, right, look, my index is 0. When I click here, oh, I have to let it run, because if I let it run, it's just gonna, right? If I click here, the index is 1. Because remember, this for each loop, right? Each one of them, as it calls that, okay? So now what do? Now that we have the index, now that we have it, what do we do with it, right? Think about that for a minute. Just think about what we're going to do with it. I got to find it. We got to get back down here. Here it is, right? So now that we have the reference to the array for the current row, what do we want to do? We want to populate that form, okay? How are we doing on time? Shall we pause here? Yeah, let's pause here. Okay, so what I'll do is pause here. Go ahead and commit your code, and I'll give you a message inside of here.